Hi, my name is Lexi Robinson, and I am a freshman studying sport management at the University of Michigan. I am a student in Professor Dooley's Education 212 History of College Athletics class. For our final project, we were given the opportunity to choose a topic regarding college athletics and make a documentary about our primary question. This documentary will focus on the involvement of women's college basketball from the 1890s to the 1930s and how the sport developed over time for women in particular. I chose this topic because I have played basketball since a very young age and have always had a passion for the sport. I grew up with an older brother who was constantly playing sports, and I was always there following closely behind. I wanted to be just like him and do everything that he did, and was lucky to have parents that allowed me to participate in anything I wanted to. From a very young age, I picked up a basketball and knew I would love the sport immediately. My dad coached me for a large portion of my childhood, and when I wasn't at practice, I would be home trying to convince my brother that I could beat him 1v1. As many know, men's basketball is much more widely talked about than women's, and the history behind men's is more publicized. I want to explore deeper into women's basketball and its history, including rule changes, the very first game played, and some key figures to women's basketball. As I joined this class and began learning about the history of college athletics, the discussion towards women always sparked my interest and made me wonder about other aspects of sports, including a variety of sports. I am focusing on basketball because we talked a lot about men's college basketball and the origin in class, but did not touch on women's, and I am curious to learn more about the development of women's basketball and how it originated. As I mentioned earlier, my research question is how did the involvement of women in college basketball develop from the 1890s to 1930s? Some questions that I will also address as part of my research are when was the first game played and who was involved? What were these games like in the beginning and how have they changed? Who are some key figures regarding women's college basketball and what impact did they have on the sport? To provide a brief overview of what I plan to talk about today, we will begin by discussing the introduction of college basketball at Naismith. We will then dive into women's college basketball and the first game played. After that, I will move towards the numerous rule changes that occurred and some reasonings behind these changes. I will tie each of these points into how the sport developed and end with a brief summary of everything I talked about. To start off, basketball was a game created by James Naismith. Naismith was a physical education director who, in 1891, invented the game of basketball as a way to make physical education more enjoyable and less dangerous. As we discussed in class, Naismith had very particular things he wanted basketball to fulfill. For example, he wanted it to be an indoor game, one that was simple but fun, was less violent than football, but was a good form of exercise. In addition, in class, we talked about how the first ever basketball game had a brawl, which went against the intentions of Naismith. The game of basketball spread incredibly fast and was something everyone enjoyed doing. The first pro league was created in 1898, only 7 years after the invention of basketball. One similarity that we pointed out in class was that they used peach baskets as the hoops, which were placed 10 feet high, just like we have them today. Basketball was a unique invention that caught the attention of many people and gained popularity quickly. This brief introduction to basketball is critical to understanding the development of the sport as a whole. Now let's talk about the first women's collegiate basketball game. On March 22nd, 1893, the first ever women's college basketball game was played at Smith College, a historically women's college in Northampton, Massachusetts. This was a monumental event for history. In order to discuss this game, we have to talk about a very important person named Senda Berenson. Berenson was the director of physical education at Smith College. She introduced basketball to her students roughly a year after James Naismith invented the game, but revised his original rules in order to adapt the game for women. She is widely considered the mother of women's basketball because of her contributions to the sport. She adapted the rules to make it easier for women to play and more acceptable for society matrons to embrace. She divided the court into 3 sections and required the players to stay in their assigned areas. The game was played for two 15-minute halves. Berenson forbade snatching the ball, holding it for more than 3 seconds, or dribbling it more than 3 times to encourage passing. Every basket earned the team 1 point, and in the beginning, games were played with peach baskets, like we discussed in class with the men's, and a soccer ball was used. With these rules, Berenson hoped to prevent a young lady from developing dangerous nervous tendencies and losing the grace and dignity and self-respect she had. In 1899, Berenson published her rules for women's basketball and 2 years later edited the first women's basketball guide published by A.G. Spalding. Berenson's version of basketball spread to many other women colleges around the nation, and she continued to edit updated rulebooks for the game for years to come. She was the forefront of women's basketball and continued to be for a long time. The National Women's Basketball Committee formed in 1905, and Berenson served as its first chair and held the position for 12 years, until 1917. She was an influential and iconic figure for women's collegiate basketball. Now that we've established the importance of Senator Berenson, we can talk about the very first collegiate basketball game between women. As I stated earlier, this was a game played at Smith College in 1893. It was a contest between members of the sophomore and first year classes. It is critical that we recognize that this was not an intercollegiate competition. Rather, it was different grade levels competing against each other at the same school. The sophomores ended up taking the victory and winning a gold and white banner as their reward. Men were not allowed to watch this competition take place, yet the gym was packed with Smith students from all class years. The first game was a step in the right direction for women and a moment of history. It paved the way for more schools to partake in college basketball and more women to form teams and begin competing. Although these rules were very strict and difficult to abide by, they were in place as a way to protect women from the harmful effects that exercise was claimed to have on the body. We discussed in class briefly how professors and athletic staff during the 1890s were worried about the health of women if they participated in sports, which was a main reason that women were not allowed to for so long. Berenson made her students play with these rules in hopes for the game to be accepted and to prevent any injuries. After the first collegiate basketball game for women, other schools became interested in playing basketball. This led to the very first women's intercollegiate basketball game where Stanford played Cal Berkeley. This game took place in 1896, only about 3 years after the first collegiate game. It was played at San Francisco's Page Street Armory with 700 spectators. These spectators consisted of only women, as men were denied admission to ensure modesty. However, many men wanted to witness this game being played, so they climbed the roof and peered in the windows. The spectators recognized that they were witnessing a societal change and an incredibly monumental moment for women in sports. This game was played with Berenson's so-called half-court rules, with court division and strict enforcement when it came to handling the ball. The game was tied the majority of the game until Stanford won on a game-winning straight throw clean from the shoulder. Stanford returned home as heroes where men cheered them on. However, in December 1899, about 3 years after this game, Stanford put an end to women's intercollegiate team sports. It was all too much too soon for them, and they were worried about the risks of women's health. Another important woman to mention in the landscape of women's collegiate basketball is Clara Gregory Bayer. Clara was a physical culture instructor at Sophie Newcomb College in New Orleans. She is notable because of her rule changes that she established, as well as the first women's basketball rules book that she published. In this book, she called the game basket. However, this name was dropped in her first revision in 1908, called Newcomb College Basketball Rules. Bayer's rules, much different than Berenson's, divided the court according to the number of players on a side. There were 11 sections if there were 11 players, 7 sections if 7 on a side, etc. There was no dribbling or guarding allowed. A player was given 6 seconds to aim and shoot the ball. This later changed to 4 seconds. In addition, no backboards were allowed. Players were only allowed to run when the ball was in the air, and then only a few steps within their area. Goals, as we know as hoops today, were changed after each score so that offensive and defensive roles were reversed and each player had the chance to do both. Uniquely, the one-handed push shot was required more than 40 years before the one-handed shot became popular in the men's game. A two-handed shot and a two-handed pass were considered fouls in Bayer's games. Bayer's rules were used widely across the South and in widely scattered places elsewhere until 1922, when Newcomb adopted official rules, meaning the ones Berenson and the Women's Basketball Committee established. There were many slight changes to the game throughout this time period. However, all the rules in place were notably an attempt to keep women safe when playing basketball and to allow them to participate in competitive activities without risking their health. It is said that around the 1930s, women's basketball began to shift towards full court play, yet it was not until the 1970s that full court play was fully adopted. So, as I mentioned, there were many ways to play this game that everyone loved and created their own rules for, until more universities and colleges started to create their own teams around the 70s. Women's half-court basketball has a rich history that has helped shape the game of basketball as we know it today. While the shift to full-court basketball was a challenging transition, it ultimately had a positive impact on the sport, making it more competitive, exciting, and widely recognized. Although half-court basketball is no longer widely played, it remains an important part of women's basketball history and a reminder of the evolution of the game over time. From the first game played in 1892 to the establishment of the Women's National Basketball Association in 1996, women have made tremendous strides in the sport. At its inception, women's basketball was seen as an unconventional activity for women. In the early years, women played with a modified set of rules, including playing half court instead of full court. Despite these limitations, women's basketball quickly gained popularity, with many women's colleges adopting the sport. As I continued my research on women's collegiate basketball, there were few records of Michigan. So I decided to meet with someone who could provide more information on Michigan's development of women's basketball. Now I'm going to introduce Jay Winkler, an archivist at the Bentley Historical Library here at the University of Michigan, and ask him a few questions. On the image on the left-hand side, the Michigan Daily wrote in 1924 that the enrollment in basketball as an elective sport is a larger proportion than any other college, and more than 250 women have signed up for interclass basketball. With this being said, would you believe that Michigan was behind in creating a women's basketball team or no?
I guess, that is the pre-varsity period. And I think that, there's a lot of different reasons that Michigan, didn't have any women's varsity sports prior to Title IX. But, very few universities had many prior to the late 50s, early 60s. But yeah, obviously Michigan didn't have any until Title IX. Um, in a lot of ways, I'm not sure. I think it's fair to characterize them as behind, especially in basketball specifically. At least up until like 1990, at which case there is a different conversation to be had about resources.
In reference to the picture in the middle, as recorded in the Daily once again, women were being urged to sign up for intramural sports, including basketball. Why do you believe they were allowed to play intramural sports rather than an official varsity team?
The ideas of one person, Margaret Bell, uh, who was an early director of the Department of Physical Education for Women prior to the any sort of like women's athletic department. But she and you see this a lot in the history of Michigan, but any college where a single specific person holds a weird amount of sway over a school either being way ahead in something or being a little bit behind in something. And so a lot of Bell's ideas were centered around the idea that somehow intramural competition was intense in a way and or excuse me, that interscholastic competition was intense in a way that playing against your classmates wasn't, and we're playing against your classmates, it built camaraderie even among the people you're an opponent with. Um, and so she just thought it was part of building a healthy woman student body, and she did not believe the same of intercollegiate sports.
In regards to the picture on the right-hand side, when I was searching through the daily, I came across a schedule that showed on January 15th, 1908, there was an open basketball game between junior and freshman girls. Do we know the purpose behind this game and why it was between these two specific classes? And do we know if this was a regular event?
Yeah, open games actually meant something specific. It meant that it was open to the whole student body. There were most women's basketball games were only open to other women. Uh, and but once a year, each class got to play an open game, in which case people could invite guests who were either from outside the school or gentlemen guests from within the school. And so, yeah, that only happened once a year.
So, as I mentioned, there's been some examples of women being allowed to play basketball before they officially created a team. What were these games like, and were the rules stricter for women than men?
But at one point, I know women had positions more like you think about positions in baseball, where they're really in one place. And I can't say for sure whether that's like the type of game that the women were playing, here at like the women's athletic building, but that is one big difference early on, and there wasn't really a lot of dribbling because there wasn't really a lot of movement. It was a almost exclusively passing based game, which is to some degree how Naismith had designed it, and then dribbling was sort of invented on accident. But
After speaking with Jay Winkler, we are able to recognize that Michigan women's basketball was not necessarily considered behind in their development of the sport. However, Margaret Bell was a factor in the slower integration of women as varsity athletes. She was the chairman of the program of physical education for women and believed that women had to protect themselves and sports were considered dangerous to their bodies. The development of early women's basketball was unique for everyone, and each university had a different timeline of when it became a varsity sport. To wrap up everything we've talked about today, we can conclude that the introduction of basketball by James Naismith led to a long history of women's basketball rule changes, games, and eventually the integration of women's college basketball as a whole. Berenson is a critical figure for women's basketball, along with Bayer. Their rule changes were important for women and allowed them to participate in basketball. From watching this documentary, I hope you learned about the first collegiate game played at Smith College and the first intercollegiate game between Stanford and Cal Berkeley. Women's college basketball developed largely throughout the 1890s to 1930s. However, the sport was not fully introduced until the late 70s. Women's basketball today continues to grow, and I cannot wait to see what the future brings for women's college basketball. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed.